Acolyte, a Tombstone fanfiction written by Cat, read by Jukebox Straws. Chapter 3. Doc was left in an uneasy peace for several days, 3 or 4 if he had to guess. Marcus still hadn't returned, and the other hunters didn't want to do anything to possibly kill Doc before the man came back. They didn't look too concerned by his absence, so Doc could only assume it was intentional. Occasionally, they'd bring him water, for which he tried not to show just how grateful for it he was, but no food. He'd never actually tried to starve his body in this iteration of himself, so he wasn't sure how it was going to go, but he knew he was hungry. The ropes began to feel a little looser before the men came to tighten them as well. He tried not to think about it. He was trying not to think about a lot of things, currently. The men mostly spent their time drinking in another room, sometimes coming in and kicking him in the feet until he snapped to awareness when they got bored. It was becoming increasingly difficult to remain cognizant. The blessed blade had been in him so long that he could feel his blood burning beneath his skin, never letting him settle. Felt like ants stinging and pinching. He could say that the one positive was that he wasn't exactly prone to infection, so the poison entering his veins was not going to give him a slow death. It would probably just be incredibly painful, up until he was finally killed. He wasn't sure where Marcus went, but he didn't think it boded well for him. It was the end of the 4th day, when he was so racked with shivers that he couldn't hear the sound of the front door opening, but he sure as hell heard it slam shut. Marcus was back. Doc knew what a pathetic sight he must make. The men had done nothing to clean him up, only the floor around him. His face was covered in dried blood and crusted with saliva, and the front of his shirt was completely disgusting. He was filthy. If it weren't for the blessed iron already running up through him, his skin would be itching from that fact alone. He barely had the energy to lift his head to watch Marcus walk in, looking much too smug for Doc's taste. His head throbbed at the change in elevation, and he grimaced. "No wise things to say," Marcus goaded, crossing his arms. "No point in wasting air," Doc murmured, barely audible. His lungs hurt less than they did the first day, but they were still tender and flared up randomly. Marcus hummed. "Suppose you're right," he agreed, nodding. Tilting his head, he asked, "Do you know where I went off to?" "To father more bastard sons, what do I care?" Doc rasped, annoyed. The hunter's eyes narrowed, but he stayed where he was. "Hadn't had to exorcise a demon as powerful as you. Went to go consult some sources," he finally said, watching for Doc's reaction. As bone-weary as he was, he had no hope of hiding the sharp zing of fear he felt from showing on his face. Exorcisms were painful, even for demons that were actually inside an unwilling host. It came from their inability to let go. Doc didn't want to know what happened to demons whose host was actually their own body. He swallowed down the panic rising in his chest, but didn't succeed very well. His heart was racing. "Ah, I thought that might scare you," Marcus said, grinning. "This is my body, you dimwit," Doc snarled, almost unable to be heard over the beating of his own frantic heart. "You stole that body. It ain't yours," the hunter growled, face dark. "I am John Henry Holliday. I sold my soul for a chance to live," he tried, voice desperate. He was ashamed of himself, but his overwhelming terror was winning out over dignity. "Don't try and save yourself now, hellspawn," Marcus said, baring his teeth in reflection of Doc's usual intimidation tactic. "Come morning, we're sending your unholy self back down to hell." Doc could only watch, wide-eyed and panting with fear as Marcus left the room, leaving him to his own devices. He was going to die in the morning. He was sure of it. What he wasn't sure of was its permanence. He was afraid he would never see Wyatt again. He was afraid he was going to have another never-ending conversation with the devil. He was downright terrified of how much pain he was going to be put through before he finally succumbed. He hoped it was fast. Silently, he knew it wouldn't be. It was the first night of his captivity that he couldn't sleep. Instead, he just stared out the one window in the room he was in until his eyes burned, and he still stared. He wondered if Wyatt was staring out their bedroom window like any other night, routine unbroken by Doc's absence. The thought hurt. He watched as the sun began to rise, and the sounds of people stirring filled the house. Closing his eyes, he tried to breathe through the fear. These last few months with Wyatt had been paradise. He'd had his Eden with Wyatt, brief as it was. He was happy. Wyatt would remember him well after Doc was gone. It was all he could hope for. He tried not to grimace at the sound of footsteps heading his way. When Marcus walked in, the 3 other hunters trailing behind him, he met the lead man's gaze unflinchingly. He would not die a coward. He was not so yellow-bellied as that. His father made sure of it a long time ago. Immediately, his eyes zeroed in on the cup Marcus was holding. His stomach roiled. There was holy water in there. Diluted, maybe, but holy all the same. Marcus followed his gaze and smiled. "Smell that, do you? Normally, just reciting the right verses is enough, but I was told for one as powerful as you, we'd have to weaken the hellish parts inside the host first," the hunter explained casually. Doc thought back to when Ike had just put a sliver of blessed iron in his drink, and how it had laid him up for over a day. He could only hope that it was diluted enough to not kill him outright. Then, suddenly, he got ice cold with terror. If the exorcism killed him, would he still be able to be sent back? The unsurety made his heart race, and his lungs began to burn with his accelerated breathing. "Phil, Danny, hold him down," Marcus ordered, nodding his head towards Doc. The big guy, Phil, and the smoker from the first night, Danny, wasted no time in walking over and holding Doc in an iron grip. Between them and the ropes, it'd be hard-pressed to move. "Gene, keep the Bible ready for me on the right page. I'll have to start reading real quick after the water's down," he said, to which Gene just silently flipped to the right page and waited. Even as restrained as he was, Doc still fought when Marcus approached him. Mustering up the small amount of strength he had left, he shoved with his shoulders and pressed against the ropes, but they held. The 2 men holding him down just gripped him tighter. "I swear, this is my body! This is mine! I was a dentist! I had tuberculosis! I was born in Georgia! Please!" Doc begged, the words burning on his tongue. He canted his head as far away from the cup full of holy water, getting closer and closer to his mouth as he possibly could. He kicked at the ground desperately, trying to force the chair back, but the 2 holding him down simply braced themselves behind him and held firm. "May God bless your unholy soul," Marcus said, grabbing Doc's jaw tightly, similar to the first night. He dug his fingers into the hinges of his jaw, forcing his mouth open. Then, against Doc's frantic struggles, he tipped the cup into his mouth, forced it shut, and pinched his nose. Immediately his mouth began to burn, and he could hear it faintly sizzling. He couldn't help the muffled groan of agony, and for a second he was so overwhelmed he couldn't even think to swallow, even as the need for air grew. "Swallow it, you idiot," Marcus hissed, glaring down at Doc. Finally, he managed to get it down. The aching burn just traveled down his esophagus and into his stomach, where it began to permeate his whole body. A ragged cry escaped his raw throat, and his whole body shaking in agony, trying to escape the pain coming from within. "Gene, I need that Bible," Marcus called, not looking away from Doc's sweaty, pale face. He squeezed his eyes shut and found that made the pain worse, but he didn't have the strength to open them again. However, he did hear Marcus take hold of the Bible and clear his throat. "Maybe it won't do anything," he thought desperately, panting in short gasps. He could hear the wet rasp on each inhale and knew that it was not a good sound. Then Marcus began to speak. "Exorcisamus te omnis immunda spirit omnis satanica potestas." Instantly, Doc knew his faint hope was in vain. Something began to stir inside him, not yet painful, but uncomfortable, like the words were awakening the demonhood inside him. Slowly it went from uncomfortable to painful, then from painful to torturous. He estimated Marcus was about to be halfway through by the time it was reaching unbearable levels. "Ved satana, inventured magister omnis facilie, hostis humanae salutis." "Please," croaked Doc, shaking hard enough that the chair was rattling faintly beneath him. Marcus continued on, as if he hadn't heard. Another few words, and Doc felt his eyes roll back in his head, and his awareness fade away abruptly. His shaking turned more violent, and he quickly realized he was beginning to seize. His whole body felt like it was on fire, his blood burning like molten lava, and he could feel each muscle and tendon contract with each moment. With every passing second, he felt more and more disconnected from his body, with his only tether being the agony he was being put through. Distantly, he heard a scream, and it took him feeling the ache in the back of his throat to realize it was him. He'd never screamed like he was now, not even when he was shot and dying in that back alley, looking up at the dark-haired man holding a hand down to him, with a creepy smile and an unholy salvation on his tongue. Not when he'd been poisoned, or stabbed, or shot, or any other method of his undoing. But now he screamed like it was all he had in him left to do, and quickly he figured out that it was. All he could do was sit there and take it, and wait for it to end. On and on it went, and Doc didn't know an exorcism could take so long, but Marcus was reading it so deliberately slowly, drawing it out. If he had the ability to speak, he thought he'd be begging some more, fruitless as it would be, but all he could do was cry out, straining against the ropes that burned him, crying out in agony, praying for a benevolence he knew he had no hope, no right of receiving. As they neared the end, the tearing pain in his chest eclipsed, and his screaming was cut off by loud, heaving coughs, interspersed with hacked gagging. Within seconds, he was throwing up blood, with nothing else in his stomach. Far, far too much blood, with chunks he didn't want to think about coming up as well. One of his ribs had finally had enough, and punctured a lung. It was a dim realization, one he wasn't even fully aware of. He only noticed it because it became harder to breathe, a feat he didn't think was possible before that moment. There was a ringing pressure building in his skull, drowning out everything but the wet sound of his breathing and Marcus's voice. It was almost over. It felt like a wet blanket had been thrown onto his brain, every one of his senses becoming dull and muffled, and even the pain began to distance itself. Soon. Terribilis Deus e sancturo suro, Deus Israel ips tredut virtutum, et fortudinem plebi sue. Benedictus Deus gloria patri. Marcus finished, snapping the Bible shut. Doc felt the words wash over him, but he didn't feel peace. Instead, all he felt was terror as his body gave one last frantic kick at the ground before he went limp. From one second to the next, his consciousness winked out. He floated in the gray nothingness for an indeterminable amount of time. He wasn't worried, as this was what usually happened. Really, he was just inordinately grateful for the lack of pain. Like usual, it didn't take long to feel like he was being sucked down somewhere. In between one second and another, he found himself staring up at the devil from where he had landed on the ground. "You again, Holiday?" the devil sniffed, frowning in displeasure. "Me again," he affirmed dryly. "What idiocy did you get yourself into now?" Doc swallowed, trying to push the memories of the last 5 days very firmly away. "Surprised you don't already know, seeing as you always seem to be in my business," Doc muttered, flinching at the sharp look his response garnered. "Believe it or not, John, I do have things to do other than keeping a baleful eye on your tedious little life," the devil answered, not amused. He loomed over Doc's body and tried not to let the slight fear he felt show too obviously. "Some hunters got me," he finally admitted, grudgingly. "They tried to exorcise me. As you can see, it didn't go well." The devil hummed. No, it didn't. They stared at each other for a minute or so before Doc got impatient. "Are you sending me back?" he asked, pretending he didn't hear the waver in his voice in the question. "And why should I?" asked the devil, smoothing down his coiled mustache idly. For a moment, Doc blanched. Managing to rally himself, he said, "I'll bring in a lot of souls, even ones you don't send me off to get." "This is true," the devil agreed, watching Doc unflinchingly. It was unnerving, but he forced himself to stay unrattled. "I don't know any other demon this side of the deadline bringing in as many souls as I do," he stated, trying to push how indisposable he really was. In truth, he couldn't give a fuck about how many souls he brought in. He just wanted to see Wyatt again, and he'd spout whatever he had to get there. Of course, the devil would be able to tell if he was lying, so he could only hope that what he was saying was the truth. The devil hummed again, smiling. "You have brought me a good many souls, Holiday. Do you feel that business will continue as well as it has?" Doc felt the weight of his soul in his chest all the more now, since he knew what it felt like to go without one. He swallowed. "Yes." The devil sighed, taking a step back. "Oh, I suppose I'll send you back up, but do be careful. This is getting repetitive, and one day I might not feel so benevolent." He could only nod, seeing a flash of hellfire in the devil's eyes at his words. Tilting his head, the devil said, "With your situation, your revival won't be very complete." "What do you mean?" Doc asked, wary. "No body of water for rebirth. I'll only be able to fix your wounds well enough to keep you alive without assistance for a short while," he grinned, teeth growing sharp around the canines. "But I can lend you a few things, for a short while." Uneasy, Doc narrowed his eyes, but didn't deny the offer. He would take what he could get. The sooner he could get out of this conversation as well, the better. "If you die again today, that's it, John. I don't have much patience for mistakes," the devil warned, the hellfire growing stronger. Before he could answer, he felt a yank in his chest, and everything went black. Back in Tombstone, Wyatt was laying on the couch within Kate and Josephine's home, trying to sleep. He wasn't able to find any rest in his and Doc's house, the bed feeling too empty, so he sought out Kate's sympathetic company. He hadn't managed to fall all the way asleep yet, just quietly dozing. Distantly, he heard Kate begin to shuffle some cards, the sound loud in the silent house. There came the slap of a card being set down onto the table, and then for a minute, there was no noise at all. "Wyatt!" Kate called, voice half frantic. The tone was enough to jolt Wyatt back to awareness. Blinking the sleep out of his eyes, he stumbled over to Kate. "What?" he muttered, peering down at her. Silently, she pointed at the card she'd placed down. Judgment. He noticed it wasn't reversed. "Explain," he said shortly. "Liberation," she murmured, eyes turning full of excitement up to Wyatt. "I think he's gotten out." The weight he'd been holding with his tense shoulders seemed to dissipate at once. "Are you positive?" "Well, you can't ever be positive with these things, but within the context of everything happening, I'm confident he'll make his way back to us," she said, looking resolute. Wyatt just continued to stare down at that card like it was a lifeline. "Don't take too long," he murmured, grateful when Kate pretended not to hear. Landing back in his body was awful. He was instantly placed back into all the agony he had felt earlier, and when he found himself missing the lack of pain down in hell, even as much as he hated the devil, it had been a nice reprieve. It took him a moment to get reacquainted with himself, and he realized two things. One being that the pain wasn't quite as bad as before, but that's like saying the difference between being run over by a large horse and a small horse. The second being that his ropes had been undone. Flexing his arms, he felt them shift loosely around him. The four hunters were talking with each other, with Marcus sounding distinctly confused. "Idiots. I tried telling them." Then the panic set in. He had to get out. He wasn't going to get another chance. He knew that if the hunters got a hold of him again, that it was all over for him. No more annoying conversations with the devil. No more second chances. No more mornings waking up in Wyatt's arms once he'd crawled in bed after his watch. Slowly, his body began to fill with adrenaline that was fueled wholly by desperation, heart pounding and muscles tensing. Then he felt his teeth sharpen in his mouth, and his nails grew and sharpened as well, the devil's gifts. Without wasting any time, he opened his eyes, grit his teeth together, and yanked the blessed blade out of his leg, grunting. The blood began to leak out almost instantly, but he ignored it. It hadn't hit an artery. It could wait. Wait until he was free. Phil was the first one to notice their prisoner back amongst the living, and his eyes widened in shock. But before he could get a warning out, Doc had launched himself across the room toward Danny, the one with his back to him. He felt an inhuman amount of strength surging through his bones, and he took advantage of that, and the hunter's surprise. Danny didn't even have time to shout before Doc's teeth were in his throat, biting for all he was worth, while at the same time stabbing the blade he'd torn from his leg into Danny's chest. Without waiting for his heart to stop, he tore the flesh between his teeth away from the rest of the man's throat and let his body drop to the ground with a thump. It seemed the only one armed with a gun was Phil. The other two had drawn their knives, so that was his next target. He felt disconnected from his body, with only his fear-driven instincts telling him what to do. Immediately he threw himself toward Phil, who desperately tried to lift the gun and aim, but Doc gripped the wrist holding the gun and dug in his newfound claws, causing the man to drop it with a shout. Before the other two decided to rush him, he slit Phil's throat with the knife and whipped around, throwing the bloodied blade straight into Jean's eye as the man ran at him. Marcus was in the corner of the room, knife held defensively in front of him, panic shining in his eyes as he took in the carnage. Doc turned toward him, panting, feeling none of the pain he knew himself to be in. Blood was dripping down his chin, but for once, it wasn't his own. He bared his teeth, grinning at how he knew their sharp ends flashed in the light. "I kept telling you this body was mine," he said lowly, creeping toward Marcus, making sure the man wasn't about to throw the knife, but it seemed he didn't know how. Doc found it almost laughable how sure they were in his demise that almost all of them had left their guns in the other room, likely next to their alcohol. I didn't know, really," Marcus tried, voice shaking as much as his body. The knife wavered back and forth. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't," Doc soothed, tone sickly sweet as he got closer and closer. "Look, I'm sorry," Marcus cried, shoving his body as far into the corner as he could. Doc relished this moment, the shift from being prey to being predator. He could smell the other man's fear in the air, and it made his blood rush in his ears. "You aren't yet," Doc murmured. "But you will be," he promised. He watched Marcus's face pale even more. Without waiting any longer, he shot his hand forward and gripped the man's wrist so tightly he dropped the knife, just like his friend on the floor behind him. He only managed a panicked, "Please!" before Doc was on him, teeth sinking so far into his neck he could taste the man's frantic pulse. Beneath him, Marcus squirmed, crying out, and Doc stabbed his claws into the other man's soft stomach, hearing him gasp out. Twisting his hand in deeper, he clenched his jaw tighter, his teeth cutting through the artery beneath him. Marcus had long enough to make his peace before Doc finally wrenched his head back, a spray of blood following him back as he tore a giant chunk from the man's neck. For a few seconds, Marcus stood there, uselessly gasping, before the excessive blood loss caught up and he stumbled forward, toppling over. He twitched helplessly for a few moments as the blood continued to grow around him, and Doc just watched, gasping for air. Soon the men stopped moving and fell still. Doc stayed for a few minutes, just to make sure everyone was dead, before he was satisfied. Haltingly, he made his way into the kitchen, grabbing his guns and his hat, and stopping beside an open bottle of rot-gut whiskey. With a grimace, he picked it up and downed half of it in one go. He was going to need it. Already he could feel the adrenaline fading and being replaced by pain. His teeth and nails were going back to normal as well. For a second, he mourned that they were temporary, but thought about it for another second and realized that they'd definitely be more detrimental if they stayed. Finally, after 5 days of being held in that shithole of a house, he stumbled out into the fresh air of the desert at night. He sucked in a deep breath, hacking it back out, but still felt relieved despite it. He was free. With the loss of the adrenaline, though, did he realize just how exhausted he was, and summoning the energy to get back to Wyatt was a hard task. The intent kept slipping through his fingers, just out of reach no matter how hard he tried. After several minutes of more and more tiring attempts, did he finally manage to latch onto the threads to get himself home. Instantly, he held on tight and let himself follow wherever it took him. He just hoped the result was as close to their homestead as possible. To be continued in Chapter 4.